Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at the recently released Carenado Beechcraft 18. Technically the Beech 18 has actually released under the guise of Asobo's local Legends series, but nonetheless the aircraft is essentially produced by Carenado. I've rather been enjoying Carenado's output into the sim thus far, and I have to say particularly been enjoying their vintage aircraft, so quite looking forward to trying out the Beechcraft here today. We're going to be taking the aircraft on a review flight, and we'll also be getting a little bit of a feel for World Update 10, which is somewhat surprisingly another US update. Great of course if you are a US flyer, and I'm sure that many of you are, but personally I was hoping to see another part of the world covered, although I know that the previous US update was somewhat lackluster compared to more modern world updates. Anyway, as you can see right behind you, we are currently on the ground at Block Island Airport, which is one of the new handcrafted airports in the sim. And we're going to take a really nice little run up the eastern US coastline from Block Island up towards initially the Rhode Island Sound, and then we'll be hopping across the water back in towards Burning Blue Designs Martha's Vineyard. It should be a nice little outing in the Beechcraft 18. We're not going to be carrying out a full review of the aircraft today, more of a review flight, but nonetheless we'll try and cover off everything as we go. I'll try and give you a good feel for the aircraft and its systems en route. Obviously we'll discuss the flight model as we go as well, and I'll take plenty of opportunities to show you the external modelling of the aircraft as well. As always with the Carenado aircraft, a pretty beautiful effort, and I think it should be a fun little flight. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. It's fairly early morning still here on the ground at Block Island. We've just got our passengers on board, so we'll head for the cockpit and we'll get the Beech 18 fired up. So good morning and welcome to yet another beautiful cockpit from Carenado. I have to say this is one of my favourite efforts of theirs so far. I really like the feel and of course the vintage of the Beechcraft 18. Anyway, all of our passengers are on board. They're pretty keen to get up towards Martha's Vineyard, so running through our before start checks. The magnetos are off, landing gear lever is down, flaps are up, cowl flaps are fully open, park brake is set. Fuel selectors, we have the left engine there on the left front tank and the right engine on the right front. For the start checks, once again confirming the park brake is set, flaps are up, fuel selectors are on. We'll be starting the left engine first. The mixture levers are in the fully rich position, prop levers are at max RPM, and throttles we can just crack 1/4 of an inch. Battery switches can go on, as can the generator switches. We'll prime the left engine. Just give it 3 pumps there on the primer. You'll notice the cockpit sounds are a little bit hit and miss, actually a little bit below Carenado's usual standards. No sounds there on the primer, same on the mixture levers for example. Engine mode selector is on the left. Magnetos are both on. We'll just open up the DV window, checking there's no one in the vicinity. Of course we'll give everyone a shout. Clear prop! We can engage the fuel boost pump, and we can engage the starter. I do find sometimes you have to tap twice on the starter for some reason. Anyway, looks like we have a good start there on the left. Come up to 1000 RPM. The startup sounds are a little bit meek, I have to say. I'd expect to hear a little bit more coughing and spluttering there as the engine catches. Anyway, there's 1000 RPM. Oil pressure just below the green at the moment, currently in the amber band. Looks like it's not going to come up any higher than that. We'll assume that's within limits for the flight today. Close up the DV window again for now. And that fuel boost pump, I can't imagine it's true to life, but as you've probably already noticed for yourselves, it's rather loud, much louder even than the engine's running. I've noticed that on a few other Carenado add-ons, and again it may be true to life of the Beech, I'm not all that familiar, but I suspect not. Anyway, running through the same on the right, mixture is set to fully rich, prop RPM is set to max, throttle is open 1/4 of an inch, battery switches are on, generators are on. We'll prime now on the right engine. A little bit tricky there to get the correct click spot. So there's 3 pumps on the right. Engine mode selector is on the right. Magnetos are both on. Once again the fuel boost can go on. And hitting the starter. And we have a good start there on the right. So we'll get rid of the booster again, close that up for now. Once again, idling at 1000 RPM, oil pressure is checked. Beacon light can go on. A little bit strange that that's out of sequence. Normally you'd have that on before the start, but we'll run it as per the checklist. Avionics master is on, and radios. We'll get everything set up for the flight. Just wait for the Garmin unit to initialise there. We're not going to bother putting in a flight plan. You can see I have actually already inserted a flight plan via the Sims flight planner, taking us out towards Martha's Vineyard. First heading is going to be 035. We'll set that up on the CDI bar for now. We'll set runway heading once we're out at the runway threshold. So there's 035 on the course, altimeter is set, transponder can go to standby. Radios we're not going to need for now, we'll tune up the Martha's Vineyard VOR later on once we're inbound towards the island. Anyway, that's our cockpit setup complete. We'll make our way out towards the holding point. So I'll come back to you once we're down at the runway threshold and ready for the run-up. Okay, so we're now down more or less at the holding point for runway 10. You can see that the windsock's pretty dead, so we're going to take just a slight tailwind here as runway 10 has us more or less departing out in the correct direction. We are ready for the run-up, so firstly coming up to 1200 RPM. And there's 1200. Mixtures are set fully rich, props are set to max RPM. And again, just checking the oil temperatures and pressures there. Still slightly low on the oil pressures. Nonetheless, we'll carry out the run-up. The checklist actually calls for the run-up at 1200 RPM, but that seems a little bit low to me, so we're going to come all the way up to 2000. And fully back here on the yoke, just to help keep the tail down. Again, the engine sound so far pretty so-so, I would say. Says 2000 RPM, almost up at full throttle there to achieve 2000, but it does look as though the engines have a fairly low max RPM limit. Anyway, we'll carry out a quick mag test. And sure enough, showing a slight drop there on the left, down to about 100 RPM drop, about 75 RPM. Back to both. Just come slightly back on the throttles there, the RPMs have crept up a little bit. And we'll check the left mag on the left engine. Again, slight drop there. And back to both, same on the right. And now showing a slight drop on the right. Back to both. And we'll do the same on the left mag. And again we have a drop. And back to both. So 2000 RPM, we'll cycle the prop levers. Interesting behaviour there from the aircraft, actually pulling the aircraft off its tail, as you can see. Just do that once more. So that's a little bit strange. Back up to 2000 RPM, we'll cycle the carpeets. And again, just showing a very slight drop there on the left. And same on the right. Oil pressure's looking good now, all temperatures are checked, same on the fuel pressures. Cylinder head temperature's getting pretty high there, as you can imagine. Running at pretty high power, so we'll come back to 1000 RPM. So carpeets are checked, fuel selectors are set. We'll get ourselves onto the runway and then we'll get the tail wheel locked up. So park brake can come off. Visibility over the front of the nose, not particularly brilliant in the Beech 18, but nonetheless it's manageable. And the aircraft taxis very nicely, it's very easy to taxi. Feels like it's got a steerable tail wheel, I'm not sure whether or not that's accurate. Everything looks to be clear on final, and clear upwind as well. We'll get the landing lights on. And the nav lights can go to strobe. Transponder can go to out. So just getting ourselves lined up here on runway 10. We'll hold the aircraft on the brakes momentarily. Can lock up that tail wheel. So lights are set. Transponder is set. We'll set the heading bug. And I think we're good to go. Okay, so feet off the brakes, coming up on the throttles. Just using a little bit of aft pressure on the yoke initially. And again, visibility out the front of the aircraft, not particularly brilliant, but to be expected with the high nose up attitude. So far the aircraft pretty reasonable in terms of directional control, quite easy to keep straight on the runway. There's full power, T's and P's looking good. A little bit of a jump out to the right there, but again, pretty easy to control with rudder. And yeah, overall the aircraft actually feels quite nice in terms of directional control. So we're airborne, we'll tap the brakes, the gear can come up. And so far quite impressed. Quite enjoyed how the takeoff felt there, a little bit heavy in pitch. Coming up through 500 feet, so we'll come back to 35 inches on the manifold pressure. And we'll just reduce those RPMs slightly as well. Come back into the green arc, so 2200 RPM. Looks like they're settling around 2100, so we'll stick with that. We'll start to turn out towards the northeast. So just leaving Block Island behind us. Rather pretty little island, we'll definitely come back and check that out at a later date. So planning on climbing up to around 5,000 feet here, although that cloud layer looks like it's probably going to be up at around 5,000. We'll see how we go on that front. Just climbing here at 120 knots, the aircraft seems quite happy climbing at those sorts of speeds. Actually climbing quite rapidly here, getting around 2,000 feet per minute rate of climb out of the aircraft, which seems a little bit high. That being said, I haven't actually loaded up the aircraft. I'm not sure by default what the loading is on the Beech 18. So we'll perhaps just come a little bit further back off the manifold pressure here, since we've got plenty of performance in hand. We'll come out slightly as well on the range on the GNS. And just running through our after takeoff checks, the landing gear is up, flaps are up, engine temperatures and pressures are checked, everything's sitting nicely now there within the green arc, including the cylinder head temperatures. We'll leave the cowl flaps open for the rest of the climb. So you can see there, looking at the GNS, we're tracking out towards the northeast initially, out towards Point Judith. That's our first visual navigation point en route. And again, 5,000 feet is going to have us sitting just in this cloud, so we'll keep climbing. We'll go up to 7,000. We'll get the pitot heat on here as well as we come through the cloud. Landing lights can go off. Yeah, so far the Beech 18 flying, I would say broadly like a typical Carenado aircraft. It doesn't feel study level, it feels fairly lightweight, but again I haven't necessarily loaded up the aircraft here. And yeah, again the performance seems pretty spectacular. That may be true to life of the real world Beech 18, but I suspect not. Even back at 30 inches we're still getting 1500 feet per minute rate of climb. Nevertheless, very smooth on the controls, feels nice in roll. Quite a bit of weight there in terms of the roll behaviour. And even in pitch, it's not too pitchy, which we have seen, of course, from quite a few Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft. And again, in terms of directional control on the runway, nothing too untowards there. The rudder felt pretty good, it was easy to keep the aircraft straight. The aircraft did want to crawl out to the right a little bit, but not completely unexpected there with the two big radial engines. Coming through 5,700 feet, so another 1,300 feet here in the climb, and that does look like it's going to put us nicely above this cloud layer. You can see the coastline there off the left wing. I have to say, I really like the Beech 18 as an aircraft. It just looks beautiful. As much as the 247 from Wing 42 is a much more exemplary product overall in terms of its functionality, I have to say the Beech 18 has the Boeing 247 beat well and truly on looks, at least in my opinion. So we're showing 5 minutes to run there, 6 minutes to run towards our first waypoint. Once we've obviously got the aircraft leveled off and accelerated a little bit though, that's going to come up quite quickly for us. Again, unfortunately going to be a bit tricky here to see the waypoints as they come up off the nose, with the nose obscuring quite a bit of the view in the climb, but that should improve a little bit here as we dip down and get the aircraft straight and level. So just coming up on 7,000 feet, we'll get the aircraft levelled off. Just build up a little bit more speed here, so we'll leave the power on for now. Again, the aircraft really smooth on the controls, very easy to hand fly. Easy to fly quite accurately as well. Seems to trim pretty nicely. We'll try the autopilot in just a moment. That's probably going to be the moment of truth. Tends to be where most aircraft using some sort of default Sobo systems tend to fall down. Anyway, speed's looking good, so we'll come back to 25 inches on the manifold pressure. And we'll go for around 2,000 RPM. A little bit sensitive there on the prop levers. The change in engine note is nice as well with the change in RPM, although again, the engines don't sound as good as they could do. And sounds do often tend to be a little bit of a forte with Carenado, so that's a tiny bit surprising. Anyway, nicely levelled off here, we'll just set the heading bug. We'll come into heading and out. Now just turn the autopilot master on. Interestingly, probably something I'm missing there, I can't see an autopilot master on the control panel there, so I've just used my key binding. That seems to have done the trick. So we're just coming up on Rhode Island Sound. You can see that just off the nose. As I say, heading out towards Point Judith. That should be just off the left wing, a little bit buried away now underneath the engine there. Anyway, we're going to track the coastline inbound towards Newport. So we'll turn now to a heading of 061. And so far the autopilot seems to be doing a pretty decent job there. We should have the Newport Bridge somewhere off at our 11 o'clock, not sure whether or not that's modelled in the sim. You can see Newport just off the nose, pretty short leg inbound towards the town itself. Anyway, we'll just run through our fuel quantities. The switch here seems to be in the reverse sense in terms of my scroll wheel, which is a little bit odd. So we're on the front tanks currently. They're evenly balanced. I presume the fuel here is given as a percentage since it says tenths of fuel. Not much fuel there in the rears, so we'll stay on the front tanks for now and probably throughout the entirety of the flight. So just running through the cockpit here as we make our way up towards Newport. Overall the ammeters there look pretty good. I guess the engine start selector can go back off now. That wasn't covered in the checklist. There are quite a few items that aren't covered in the checklist. Overall though, cockpit functionality seems to be pretty good. It doesn't look like the oil dilution works, but most of the switches do seem to function. Pretty nice set of avionics as well. Quite capable aircraft really, the Beech 18. We've obviously got the HSI as well as the GNS unit. It would be nice if we could switch this out with either the PMS or the TDS unit, but that doesn't seem to be an option. And again, being essentially a Sobo aircraft, I haven't yet found any Carenado style iPad, which is one of my main gripes really with these Sobo aircraft coming in off the back of Carenado. Generally, if it's a straight up Carenado aircraft, we do tend to get a little bit more functionality as a result. For example, most of the Carenado aircraft you can select the PMS GTN 750. Anyway, we've got our EGTs there, showing a little bit lower on the right hand engine versus the left, despite the same power settings, so that's quite nice, a little bit of nuance there. Also got our fuel computer. And as I said, overall I think a pretty nice effort from Carenado. Centre temperatures are right at the bottom of the band now, so we'll get the cowl flaps closed up. T's and P's looking good. Yeah, just coming up on Newport, just coming overhead the town or the city. You can see the same there on the GNS. Next heading we're looking for is 116, inbound towards Martha's Vineyard. We'll set that initially on the course bar. And as I say, we'll tune up the Martha's Vineyard VOR in just a moment's time. We'll track that inbound. There's 116. Just wait until we come overhead Newport and then we'll start the turn. In terms of the frequency, Martha's Vineyard, it's the Mike Victor Yankee VOR 114.5. So we can tune that up now. It says 1145, Mike Victor Yankee identified, 291 radial outbound at the moment and showing 32 miles to run. Just coming onto the CDI bar there, we'll turn onto the heading. And once we're bang on that CDI bar, we'll come into nav, we'll check that out. You can see we do only have a heading and a roll mode, but we do also have a navigation selected down here on the right, so we'll set that to nav in just a moment's time. So again, overall the Beech 18 actually a pretty capable platform. You can certainly navigate the aircraft quite nicely with what's available. Showing 30 miles to run and 30 minutes inbound towards Martha's Vineyard. Visibility in the aircraft not particularly great. It's not a great sightseeing option since you've got most of the view there blocked by the radial engine. The view out the front is reasonable, but again not brilliant for sightseeing. You've really only got the DV windows down on either side. But again, just the aesthetic of looking over those wonderful radial engines I think makes up for the slight loss of scenery. I would just again though like some slightly better sounds with those engines. It's not quite giving me the feel I want here in the aircraft. Anyway, coming to that CDI bar, so we're going to nav. I would assume we leave the aircraft in heading otherwise, but we'll see how we go there. I wonder actually if that's not the autopilot master as well by the looks of things. We'll just double check that. Okay, so the master switch is also the roll mode there. Come back into heading. So you can see we are now on nav. We've got nav, heading, loc, and loc back course. The aircraft should start to make a right hand turn momentarily to take us inbound towards the CDI bar. Such a nice clear day here, we can already actually see Martha's Vineyard off the nose. We're going to be cutting across the Cutty Hunk private airfield. That's again just off the nose, a small little island there, just out to the south of the most westerly island. Anyway, we've only got about 10 minutes now here until we're actually inbound towards destination, so we'll take the opportunity to briefly head outside the aircraft. We'll only be outside for a few minutes and then we'll come back as we make our approach and descent in towards destination. Okay, so we're just coming up overhead Cutty Hunk Harbour. We've got about another 5 minutes to run here. Pretty good time now to start our descent, so we'll come out of out. We're just going to go for around a 500 feet per minute rate of descent. And we'll come in onto the south-easterly runway for Martha's Vineyard, since that's pretty much a straight approach. So in preparation for that, we're just going to turn slightly out here onto a heading of around 100 degrees. One thing I have noticed with the autopilot, actually wasn't having too much joy there in the end in terms of getting the aircraft to follow a nav track. I think I have everything set up correctly, at least to my understanding, but that may be user error on my part. Nonetheless, I was easily, of course, able to fly the CDI bar with the heading bug, but it didn't seem to want to track the CDI bar itself. So a little bit surprising there. Anyway, just coming down through 6,000 feet. And again, we've got Martha's Vineyard just off at our 1 o'clock. Really nice little hop in the Beech 18 so far. Again, very much enjoying the aircraft. We'll fly overhead Martha's Vineyard, see what the wind's doing, but it should be pretty dead down there. We're only looking at around 4 knots. Sure we can make out the airfield itself just yet though through the clouds. But we'll keep a good eye out. We'll fly the rest of the approach manually. We'll actually just take the autopilot out here, and we'll just edge our way through the gap in the clouds here to take us overhead the top of the airfield. Again, the wind should be pretty minimal, so we'll just take the runway suits us best in terms of the landing and the taxi. As we descend here as well, we can just start richening up those mixtures. Again, you can see the EGT gauges there working quite nicely. And just reducing the power as well a little bit here. We'll maintain 25 inches in the descent, keep the speed. As I say, we'll fly the descent and the approach manually here. That'll give us a little bit more of a feel for the aircraft's handling. But again, overall, no qualms really with the Beech 18's handling. It's very easy to fly, very stable as well. Don't really need to trim or adjust the controls once you've got the aircraft straight and level. So even without the autopilot, it's actually quite an easy aircraft to take on some slightly longer sectors, but nonetheless with the autopilot, of course, that really is a benefit to the aircraft if you do want to take it on some longer journeys. So we've got Martha's Vineyard now just off at our 11 o'clock. We'll probably come back in towards the southwesterly runway there, just so that it's a little bit easier for the taxi back in. Just check our fuel quantities again before we commence the approach. Again, that gauge is in the reverse sense. So we're showing about 3/10 in each of the front tanks and about 1/10 in each of the rear tanks. So again, we'll stay on the front tanks for the approach. Aircraft actually going into a little bit of a climb there. I guess we're getting a little bit of lift perhaps off that bank of cloud. Just come slightly further back on the power now. We'll just increase our rate of descent a little bit here. So I think we'll fly over the top of the airfield. We'll come into a left-hand traffic pattern, as I say, back onto the southwesterly runway. In terms of the weather conditions, the wind should be around 280 at 4 knots, so favouring a westerly direction anyway. Obviously the visibility is great. It's 14 degrees, so fairly chilly morning there on the ground, and QNH 2990, we've got the altimeter set already. And again, we'll just keep richening up those mixtures. I'm not going to bother with the carb heats here since they don't actually operate using the default key binding, and I don't really want to be fiddling around on short final with the levers. A little bit high here to be able to make out the windsock, see what the wind's actually doing. Although interestingly, I noticed one of the notes with the update was an improved visibility on the windsocks, which is great. Often it can be really hard to see them until you're right on top of them, which of course is not much use. You can see the easterly edge of the Martha's Vineyard Island. We've got Katama Airfield somewhere down. I think you can see it actually just out to the right of the windshield wiper there. So just coming overhead the airfield, we'll make a fairly gentle left turn here into the traffic pattern. And coming back now to around 18 inches manifold pressure. Just coming through 4,500 feet. Again, continuing to increase the mixtures here as we descend the aircraft. Got Vineyard Haven just off the left engine. It's funny, I have to say I wasn't particularly blown away by Burning Blue Designs doing an American airport. I very rarely fly in the US personally, but actually probably one of my most used sceneries at this point. It's tended to fit in quite nicely with a few flights that I've had planned. There's 4,000 feet. Again, a little bit tricky to actually make out the field here. Most of it's buried underneath that wing. We're just going to extend downwind here to give us a little bit more time to get the aircraft descended into the traffic pattern. We'll get our downwind checks out of the way. So brakes are checked and off. Undercarriage will hold for now. Mixtures are rich. Fuel pump, again, I think given the amount of noise that thing generates, we'll leave that off for now. Fuel quantities have been checked. Landing lights can go on. Flight instruments are checked and harness is secure. Seatbelt signs should be on, they are on as well. So down at pretty low manifold pressure now, cylinder temperature is still looking good, we've got those cowl flaps closed up, rest of the T's and P's are good. All temperature is getting a little bit low. So again, so far I'm actually quite impressed with Carenado's efforts on the aircraft. Most of the systems, of course there's not a whole lot of depth to them, but they broadly seem to respond as you would expect. Just going to extend slightly further here on downwind and then we'll turn onto base. Just don't want to end up too high here on the approach. It's all clear on final, I think we can start our turn onto base now. Take the gear down. Fairly nice sounds there on the gear, and we do have a gear down indication. So just getting that speed back into the white arc. We'll start taking the flaps. The aircraft does need quite a bit of trim as you come back on the speed, but that's to be expected. So we're going to maintain 100 knots for now. We'll take a stage of flap. Yeah, overall the sounds on the aircraft aren't bad, as I said. There's some areas that definitely need some work, but there's some areas that are quite nice. Certainly most of the associated sounds do have rather a vintage feel to them. So there's flaps 30. And just bring the aircraft round onto final. It does perhaps feel just a touch light on the controls here as we bring the aircraft round onto final. Now we'll go flaps 45. So pretty high flap angle there, that should give us quite a bit of drag. Help get the aircraft down. We'll maintain 100 knots for now, we'll slow up as we come on to short final. Anyway, we're good on the runway centerline. Can't see a PAPI there, but we're looking pretty good on profile now as well. So running through our finals checks, just coming through 1,000 feet. Pitch is full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set, landing clearance not required, the runway is clear, the speed just getting a little bit low there, so coming up on the throttles. Okay, so nicely lined up on final. We are showing high on the PAPI, but there is a bit of an issue there with the lights currently. I assume that's as a result of the update. You can see the runway lights there are slightly higher than the actual runway itself. Just starting to let that speed bleed off now. Back to around 80 knots as we come over the threshold. Looking at the windsock, we are into wind, so the easterly runway a good option here. Just coming through the lights. And just starting to ease back off those throttles. Flock of birds there off on the right. Just coming back on the yoke as well. The aircraft feels pretty good in the flare. It's easy to flare the aircraft. A little bit of a float. There's touchdown. The aircraft does feel fairly floaty on the landing. We are actually on the ground here, and you can see we've still got the stall warning horn, and it still feels more or less like we're actually flying. Anyway, fully back on the yoke. We'll brake to vacate at taxiway Charlie here. So vacating off to the left, onto Charlie, and we'll make our way in towards the terminal. The afterland checks, the flaps can come up. All clear on the right. We'll make our way, as I say, in towards the main terminal building here. There's that flock of birds again. A really nice little touch from Burning Blue Design on that one. Just hold off on the rest of our checks until we've got the aircraft parked up. It's a fairly busy little apron. Looks like we should have a spot just out to the left here of the BizJet, so we'll take that. Just keeping a good eye on our wingtip clearance. We're good on the King Air. And we're good off on the right as well. Looks like we've got another group of passengers waiting just to board the aircraft. Park brake can go on. Again, just coming up to 1000 RPM on the throttles. Transponder can go off. We'll get the landing lights off. Nav lights can go back to steady. Pitot heat can come off. Avionics master is off and running through the shutdown checks. The flaps are up. Power levers are set. Mixtures can come back to idle cutoff. And a good shutdown there on the left. Engine taking a nice amount of time there to run down as well. So good cut there on the left. We'll do the same on the right. And a good run down there on the right. We'll close the throttles, mags can come off. The gang bars do work, which is a nice little touch. Alternators and batteries can come off. And that is the shutdown checklist complete. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the Carenado Beechcraft 18. Fairly typical fare from Carenado really. Once again, a really beautiful visual model both internally and externally. Texturing is right up there as one of the very best examples that we've seen in the sim. Sounds, I would say, are 50-50. There were certainly points throughout the flight where I rather enjoyed the engine sounds, but at other times the aircraft did sound a little bit lackluster. I would say perhaps not one of Carenado's best efforts on the sounds to date. We also saw as well that some of the cockpit sounds were missing, which is a little bit disappointing. Just a few areas there that could do with polishing up. Systems-wise, I thought the aircraft was actually pretty good. Again, not too much depth behind those systems, but that's to be expected at this sort of a price point. Overall though, it was hard to find really any bugs and everything seemed to work broadly within the correct parameters. I would just question the nav mode on the autopilot. That certainly could be user error, but again it did seem to be a pretty similar system to the Just Fly Arrow and I'm fairly familiar with that. In terms of the flight modelling, overall again a fairly typical effort from Carenado there. The aircraft flew quite nicely for the most part. Takeoff was actually surprisingly good. The aircraft was pretty easy to control in terms of yaw. To hand fly, the aircraft was fairly pleasant. It did have a nice amount of inertia and weight in roll. Again, not particularly twitchy in pitch and pretty good on the rudder. The only thing I would say about the flight model, the aircraft did feel quite lightweight. Initially I did have it only loaded with the pilot, but I tried later on loading it up with some passengers as well, and overall it just doesn't feel like a particularly heavy aircraft. We saw that as well with the aircraft's performance. We were getting 1500, 2000 feet per minute rate of climbs out of the Beech 18, which again, I'm not all that familiar with the aircraft, but I can't imagine that's true to life of the real world airframe. Overall, the aircraft was easy enough to put down on the ground, but it certainly felt quite floaty once we touched down. Really, it felt like we were still flying the aircraft right down to almost taxi speed. So the flight model, pleasant enough. The aircraft's pretty easy to fly, but again, obviously not a study level effort that we're looking at here. I think we got a pretty good opportunity to take a look at both the cockpit and the external model of the aircraft. Obviously we didn't get to touch too much on the cabin, so we'll just briefly take a look at that. Once again, the cabin modelled and textured very nicely. It's good to see as well that the cabin door does function, as does the sliding table. So really more than enough attention to detail in the cabin, as we would expect from Carenado. And in a similar fashion, we didn't get a chance to look at the cockpit night lighting, so we'll just briefly look at that. And the same really, I think a very nice effort from Carenado. The night lighting ambience looks pretty good. There are a few rotary selectors as well, so you can adjust the various lighting options. But certainly the lighting is very functional, and I think it looks quite nice. FPS wise, the aircraft was pretty good there as well. We were getting about 81 FPS in the Beechcraft 18, as opposed to around 95 in the default Cessna 152, so dropping about 14 frames overall versus a default aircraft. I would say that really I don't have too many major gripes with the aircraft. Again, looking at this particular price point and given that it is a local Legends aircraft, overall I thought the Beech 18 was a pretty solid effort. As I mentioned during the flight itself, it would certainly be nice to have the onboard tablet that I'm sure we would have seen had Carenado released the aircraft on their own. As a result, no external ground equipment and no option to choose between the default GNS or perhaps introduce the PMS GTN 750. I think that would have gone a long way towards enhancing the aircraft, and it would also be nice to have the option to remove the GNS entirely and have a slightly more period appropriate panel. Nonetheless, as I said, I did really enjoy the cockpit. I like the feel of the aircraft, and I think overall it's got a really nice set of instrumentation, pretty complex set of avionics, and it makes the Beech 18 quite a capable aircraft. In short, I wouldn't say that the Beech 18 is anything to write home about, but it is a very nice effort from Carenado, one of the better local Legends that we've seen in the sim to date certainly. I really enjoyed my outing in the Beechcraft. I'm fairly sure I will fly it again at some point. Again, I really like the cockpit and the overall ambience of the little Beech 18. One of the more beautiful aircraft in the sim to date, and again a real joy to fly just in terms of the overall visuals with those two radial engines sitting right outside your peripheral vision. As far as World Update 10 goes, obviously we didn't get a huge chance to see most of that, but Block Island Airport looked to be pretty nice. Overall though, the imagery, I didn't see any huge improvements there, but we only looked at a very small portion, of course, of the US. As I say, as a non-US resident, it would have been nice to see somewhere else in the world covered. There's still plenty of areas throughout the Microsoft Flight Simulator world that do need improvement. Nevertheless, a few interesting new additions to the sim, and I'm sure there'll be some great scenery to check out going forward. As always guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. A very big thank you once again to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It's hugely appreciated. I do hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.